I'm Liz Tay from North Sydney Conversations. We are a community group working to connect the people of the Lower North Shore with subject matter experts and each other so that we can discuss big issues in a respectful and an informed way. I'd like to start tonight's discussion by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and their elders past, present, and emerging. On behalf of my colleagues, Susie Bessel, Trine Barter, and Johnny Kennedy, we're excited to bring to you tonight a discussion about the barriers that women still face in Australian workplaces and how and why we need to tear them down. There will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the evening. Please post them in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And after the Q&A with the panelists, you're all invited to stay on as well for an optional chat roulette where we randomly allocate people into small groups of 4 to continue the conversation. Now it's with great pleasure that I introduce our 4 wonderful guests. Liz Broderick was Australia's longest serving sex discrimination officer, and she's currently the UN Special Rapporteur and independent expert of its working group on discrimination against women and girls. Throughout her career, Liz has worked tirelessly to promote gender equality and break down structural and social barriers faced by women and men. She founded the Champions of Change strategy that encourages influential men to take action on gender equality, and she's led 16 major cultural reviews into our national institutions, including the Australian Defence Force. In 2016, she was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia and also named the New South Wales Australian of the Year. Ming Long is a non-executive director who's worked in a broad range of industries, including financial services, funds, and investment management, as well as real estate. Ming is the first Asian woman to lead an ASX 100 or 200 listed entity in Australia. She currently chairs AMP Capital Funds Management and Diversity Council Australia. She's the director of several companies and a member of Chief Executive Women. Ming led the establishment of the Property Male Champions of Change and was named one of the 100 Women of Influence and a finalist in the Telstra Business Women Awards. Sam Mostyn has enjoyed a diverse career across business, politics, science, the arts, the not-for-profit sector, and sport. That's a whole lot. She was the very first female AFL commissioner and now serves as a non-executive director on the boards of Virgin Blue, Transurban, and Citigroup Australia. In 2012, Sam was named one of the 100 Women of Influence by the Australian Financial Review and Westpac. She's a prominent advocate for sustainability and climate action, equality of opportunity for women, the need for diversity in leadership, and reconciliation with Indigenous Australians. Our moderator tonight is Catherine Fox. She's a local to the North Sydney electorate. She's a leading commentator on women and the workforce, an award-winning journalist, author, and presenter. Catherine's had a long career at the Financial Review and has published 5 books, including Stop Fixing Women, which, along with her journalism, was awarded the 2017 Walkley Award for Women's Leadership in Media. I'll now hand over to Catherine to moderate tonight's conversation. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the entire team. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I am indeed on Camaragal land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's always lovely to work with this group, and when we were planning tonight, we were hoping to bring you a really top-notch group of people to speak about this incredibly important topic, but we've overachieved. I have to say, this is a dream team for me, and absolutely lovely to see all 3 of these extraordinary Australian leaders with us tonight. And I know they're super busy and have numerous other things going on in their lives, so we do appreciate them coming along. I thought I might just start by sort of giving you a little insight as somebody who's been an advocate for change in this area for such a long time. I've noticed over about the last year that I've been asked increasingly to speak and write about topics that I felt that we'd already come a long way on, but I've been asked to revisit. Things like, you know, why merit is compromised by targets and quotas, you know, why we shouldn't have quotas, why we shouldn't be mandating action in this area. Is the gender pay gap real, or is it just an exaggeration? Things like that. And then going back over over why women, in fact, are possibly to blame for all of this, you know, because we inherently lack confidence. Don't even start me. So there's some stuff that I feel like we've been asked to sort of re-establish, a case to be made all over again, which I think tells us a lot about where we are. So I've suggested to the panel that we might start off by talking about what's been happening this year. Of course, at the beginning of this year, it feels like a decade ago, but at the beginning of this year, there was that burst of extraordinary energy. We had the appointment of Grace Tame as Australian of the Year. We had the very sobering revelations of Brittany Higgins, but out of that, the March for Justice. I was in the centre of Sydney with 10,000, mainly women. It was extraordinary. And yet, since then, I feel that momentum has ebbed and flowed. And I just thought it'd be interesting to start off, and I might actually go to you, Ming, if you don't mind. I just wondered, what do you think has come out of this year as perhaps one of the more surprising, or an issue that you think has become more pressing? What's changed and what hasn't in this extraordinary few months?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I mean, it's interesting because so many times when you're working in this area, you feel like it's 2 steps forward and then like a giant leap back. But I think even with you know, COVID and everything we've seen, this is actually the best opportunity we have to progress women and to make sure that women, particularly as we're coming up to a federal election, are in effect on the ballot box when people vote and make decisions about what happens to this country going forward. You know, you're absolutely right in terms of seeing the young women like Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins with the courage they have to speak up. And it's so good to see the rise of younger women. But it's never just waiting for the next generation. So I would appeal to people who are older on this call. It's a full court press. It's every single person, every single generation, every single leader, every single team. And there's actually freedom we were just talking about before, in even the older women stepping into the arena, because, you know, sometimes when you're older, you care less about what people think of you, so you're more likely to just call it as it is. And this is the opportunity for people to actually step into that arena and make your voice heard, because I am very conscious that there are some younger women who cannot do that because their jobs and their economic security still rests in their silence in many issues. So that's sort of my appeal. It's interesting when you made the introduction. Yes, I am on a subsidiary board at AMP. I am also on a subsidiary board at QBE, and they've both been in the media. But even when I look at those two organisations, obviously I'm involved with them, the opportunity for change in an organisation when you are so publicly humiliated, and there are lessons then learnt by every other single organisation about what to do or what not to do. And the fact that corporate licence to operate is absolutely alive and well and must be on the table when leaders like ourselves are making decisions, that you actually get an acceleration of change in those times of crisis, because people realize, oh my God, I cannot keep on doing what I've done in the past. I've really got to pivot and make sure that we actually have more women in leadership. And we're absolutely seeing that well, because I'm involved with them, I'm seeing that in both organizations now. And it is very much top down, but also from the employee cohort, because they demand that level of change. So I'm actually quite optimistic, even though it may feel quite gloomy, because the opportunity is absolutely, I feel, within grasp.
Yeah, no, I absolutely take your point. And of course, we do forget that progress absolutely has been made. I don't know if any of you saw the interview with Kirsty Fraser-Kirk, who was the young employee at David Jones many years ago, and 10 years ago, in fact. And I was just thinking of how differently that was covered in the media, and the different dynamics now around that. So yes, absolutely agree with that. Liz, when we were chatting before tonight, you mentioned that Australia's gone through a cultural reckoning. And I wonder if you could tell us what you think that cultural reckoning is, and where we are at the moment.
I think coming off the back of Grace Tame, and how fantastic to see her as Australian of the Year. And I can't remember the exact words she said, when she was awarded the Australian of the Year, but she basically said, you know, I've always been told to be silent. You told me not to speak. Well, hear me now. And I think that's what shifted, particularly in the area of sexual harassment and the community's tolerance for it. I do a lot of work looking at culture in major institutions, from global resources companies through to the Parliament of New South Wales, conducting a cultural review at the minute, and of course some of the cultural organisations. And there has been a huge shift. Behaviour which would have maybe even been tolerated 2 or 3 years ago is no longer tolerated. And I think leaders are starting to understand there's more risk associated with trying to kind of push that under the carpet, rather than actually come out and be transparent about what's happening. Because we're in an era of radical transparency, of social media. Everyone can speak and hopefully tell their story at a time of their own choosing. And so I think it has really shifted. Having said that, there's still so many places where it's not safe to speak, and particularly in the workforce. And maybe that's one of the areas that we can explore there, Catherine. But I do think, it's the one thing that I'm optimistic about in terms of the global context. I'm actually quite pessimistic. I'm distressed about what I'm bearing witness to at the minute. But in terms of a shift to cultural reckoning, particularly on sexual harassment, I feel pretty positive about that in Australia.
Yeah, good to hear. Sam, I just wondered if we can turn to you now. As president of CEW, of course, you announced some research recently of the ASX 300, and you might want to fill us in a little bit on that, and indeed the implications, because of the stats were not great around the women in leadership space, were they?
No, no. I think we started the report by saying it made dismal reading, which is a terrible way to start a report, but we felt we needed to be honest. I'm joining you all from Gadigal land across the harbour here in Sydney, and also want to pay my respects to elders and to any First Nations people on the call. And I thought, before I get into that kind of more difficult stuff, and I agree with the optimism that Ming and Liz have about what's changed, I thought maybe I'd start with a bit where you were at the very beginning of the year, because I think we did see something that we've got to now grab hold of again as we go into the 2022 period and claim our space as part of what will be a post-pandemic economy and society. And it goes to your point about Grace, but the 4 names of the Australians of the Year were all women: Grace, Miriam Rose, Isabel and Rosemary. And if you didn't read their stories when they were awarded, read them now, because they represented to me one of the most diverse, interesting groups of women who were on the stage next to our Prime Minister, actually heralding what Australia looks like. Women of colour, Indigenous women, young women, advocates, young women calling out the big issues. So I think we started really well. And then pretty early in the year, the Sydney Peace Foundation announced that the winners of this year's Sydney Peace Prize, Megan Davis, Professor Megan Davis, Pat Anderson and Noel Pearson. And that was for really the work that Megan and Pat did, leading the Uluru Statement and the dialogues that got to the Uluru Statement from the heart. And they were women-led. So I think there was a start of the year that was really exciting. So I think if we can hold that and think about what that means for us as we claim our space again, because in the meantime, I think COVID did what all of you understand and have already heard about, and it deepened any pre-existing disadvantage that existed in the system. And we have a heavily disadvantaged system for women in this country, and particularly in the notion of workplace and our safety. And so I agree with Ming that our workplaces are going to be much better. There are really great signs all over the country of better outcomes, but our workplaces during COVID were really hard on women. 2 bits of research that Chief Executive Women released during the course of the year. The first was around a call for equitable flexibility. You may recall, as we went into COVID, everyone said we're going to take these great learnings of flexibility and working from home. It's going to be great for women because women can actually do lots more from home and manage children and homeschool and do the shopping and the cleaning, and they're going to be great leaders. And that last bit about, and they'll be great leaders, just doesn't hold up, because we know from the research done on how flexibility might be introduced in a post-COVID world, that if women aren't present and noticed, but are hidden back at home doing all that work, they're not in the same sort of prominent line for promotion. And indeed, the ABS figures at the moment on our unemployment rates and people seeking work reveal that during the year, it's women who have been voluntarily removing themselves from the paid formal workforce because they just can't do that and everything else. So there's an issue there, and we raise that through a notion of equitable flexibility, asking for all leaders to ensure that flexible approaches in organisations were equally appropriate to men. We wanted more men taking parental and carers leave, being out of the office, and seeing people promoted who were taking advantage of flexible arrangements. So it was a big call out to leaders to not just let the flexibility arrangements further hurt women's progress. But then we came to the CEW census that you mentioned, Catherine, and this is where it was dismal. Each year we analyse the progress of women in senior management in the ASX companies. We've done it for 5 years, previously only the top ASX 200. This year we extended it to the 300. And in the ASX 300, in 2021, only 1 of 23 appointments to chief executive went to a woman. Only 1. Today, there are only 18 women chief executives in the top 300 ASX listed companies in this country. And the trend was the same this year as it was 5 years ago when we started doing our data collection in 2017. So that was the reason we used the word dismal. We know that there are pernicious and difficult problems inside organisations that lead to why women don't make it up into the roles from which women are drawn, or people are drawn to be leaders. But we did discover anecdotally in COVID that when we asked those leaders those boards who appointed men, the 22 positions of the 23, why they didn't appoint women, they said it wasn't a time to take risk, and it was time to remain safe with people we know, as in people like us, men like us. So we've been out there advocating for a return to an actual equitable arrangement around the targets for women. We've actually cited all the research from the World Economic Forum that has Australia listed as #1 in the world for women's education, but this year, 70th in the world for economic participation. So that's the story that unfolded for us. And we can talk about the segregation of work in this country and how women are monumentally disaffected at the moment, and then come back up to what we can all do. But it was pretty telling stories about how COVID affected women much, much more than men during this period, and that the work ahead of us is to address that.
Yeah, and the picture is not exactly rosy in many other countries that we often compare ourselves with. But Liz, I wondered about your thoughts on that. You've got that international hat that you wear. We do hear, and in fact, there was a very good article, and we'll come back to it, in that Australian journalist who used to be at the Fin Review, Nabila Ahmed, wrote recently for Bloomberg about Australia lagging, in a particular way for cultural factors. And we may explore them in a minute, but I just wonder what you make of that. Are we not performing as well? Certainly that gender gap index that Sam just mentioned does show we're at 70th, and I can well recall we were around the 20 mark for a long time. So that definitely shows that we've gone down. But what's happening elsewhere?
In terms of what's happening elsewhere, I think really when I look at it and through my UN role, so in my UN role, Catherine, I do a number of things. One is I write to nation states each week, drawing to their attention human rights violations against women and girls. I also undertake country visits, although of course that hasn't been operating over the last 18 months because of COVID. But what we're seeing across every region of the world is that we stand at a crossroads in terms of gender equality. Because in so many countries, and COVID's part of this picture, we're seeing, a rise, as Sam just says there, in a period of mass disequilibrium, we want to go back to tradition, what we know, what we thought was certain. We don't want to take risks. So that's about going back to tradition in the family, in the workplace, in religion. We're seeing the rise of religious fundamentalism in many parts of the world, and indeed some would argue here in Australia we're seeing more and more creeping of religion into our political spaces. But we are also seeing in some countries, and I'd be remiss not to talk about Afghanistan. I think many of us have been focusing on what's happening in Afghanistan, the Taliban's rapid takeover of that country, this idea that, this time Taliban 2.0 are going to be so different. And the country's different. There's no question about that, because for the last 20 years, women have had a high level of freedom. And just even looking at the week before the Taliban came back, There were 27% of the seats in Parliament were held by women. We had female cabinet ministers. We had women had access to justice. There were millions of women in school, in high school, in university, and almost 10% of women in private sector, in the business world, were leaders and managers. So that was the picture. But as we know, that can shift in literally 2 weeks. I mean, women have been erased from public life in that country. And as the Taliban have said, they should stay at home for their own safety because our people are not necessarily trained in how to respect women, which I thought was quite telling. But so we've seen some countries really shift in a big way like that. We have seen, coming back to your original point, Catherine, and just more on the pushback, because where the pushback is pointy-ended is on women's reproductive rights. Yep. So what we've seen in Texas just in the last few weeks is an almost total ban on abortion under any circumstances. So that's whether you're raped, incest, anything else. And interestingly, we've seen a bounty or private citizens incentivized to actually sue anyone associated with the procurement of abortion, from the Uber taxi driver to the secretary in the abortion clinic, a payment of $10,000 cash if that claim is successful. So we're seeing in many regions of the world a real pushback on women's reproductive rights. And next month, actually, in my role as UN Special Rapporteur, I'll come together with others to actually go as what we call amicus curiae, so a friend of the court. This is into the US Supreme Court, which will hear the first ever matter which will directly contest Roe versus Wade, which was a 1973 decision, which most people on the call will know, said that it's unconstitutional for any US state to ban abortion before human viability, which is at about 23 weeks. So it's a pretty crazy time. I think the pandemic is, as Sam says, it's worsening the situation. We're seeing levels of violence increase against women and girls. In some regions of the world, up to 300%. We're seeing disproportionate impact on women's unpaid caring work. Here in Australia, women were doing 3 times the amount of paid care prior to the pandemic. That's doubled again. And as you said, Catherine, we're seeing women drop out of employment, particularly globally, because they're in more precarious work. So that's the global picture. And Australia is losing ground even in that environment, and particularly amongst the developed nations of the world. So I think, coming back to Ming's point, that means that every one of us, particularly those who might have been sitting on the fence about whether I need to get involved in, gender equality, women's rights, now is the moment. It will take every one of us to really step up in a way, particularly as we work out what it takes to live with COVID, to reinvent the systems and structures. We need to put gender equality and women's human rights at the heart of that reinvention.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to ask you, I mean, we had many conversations over the years about diversity in a broader sense in our organisations in Australia. That hasn't shifted nearly as much as I guess one would have hoped either. And that intersectionality between race and gender is still quite a lethal one, isn't it? I just wonder where you see things in that arena at the moment.
So was that to me?
Yes, it was.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yep. I mean, it's probably not as progressed as where we are generally around just the discussion around gender. How I've always described this, this movement is that we are not at war with each other. We're actually all at the same side. And, there's so much more research around the impact of gender in any sort of organisation. And it doesn't take much to then draw it out to broader diversity to understand the impact that race can have. It's actually, some of the research shows that actually has a twice the impact of just looking at gender. But then, when you include all the aspects of diversity within our country, I always talk about status quo and other, because the status quo in any organisation will be different. But I mean, most of the organisations we're talking about, the status quo will be, You know, it will be a white man. It'll be Caucasian people within the organization. It'll be abled people within an organization. It'll be non-First Nations people within the organization. And to make sure that when we're talking about gender, we're really talking about all forms of that diversity, to make sure that everybody has the best opportunity to give their best to our country. The research that we've done at Diversity Council will show that, you know, we do an inclusion index every couple of years, that when you have a look at the most excluded people in our organizations, First Nations, right at the bottom, women, oh, sorry, people with a disability, the second most excluded people in our organizations. You know, it just, you know, we think about the Royal Commissions we have and all that sort of stuff. The other piece of research which was quite groundbreaking we did last year in Diversity Council was our class at work research, which showed that effectively from a socioeconomic perspective, people of the lowest class actually are also the most excluded people and have the least opportunity in all of our organizations. This is beyond gender, it's beyond race, it's beyond everything else. It's the socioeconomic position or class of that person. And then when you break that research up, women of the lower class, I'm going to be blunt and just abbreviate it that way. You can go and have a look at that research and how it's defined. Women in that lower class actually really appreciate work around D&I. They get why it's in place. They support it, you know, do everything they can to amplify it within the organisation. They see the benefit. It is actually the men of the lower class that actually see no benefit from D&I work, even though the research will show that they actually do benefit from that work. So, you know, the intersection of a number of identities that we bring to the table will amplify some of the discrimination or, you know, some of the barriers that we will face. And I just really want to stress, this is not war between race and gender. This is not, do you know what I mean? We are actually all on the same side when we're talking about these things, about including people that should be at the table when we're thinking about a post-COVID world that, you know, Sam's talking about, build back better, you know, all that sort of stuff. This is the moment to make sure that when we're building a new society, because we've been so disrupted with the old, that we have these voices at the table. The one thing I would say, you know, the lessons learned from even just sitting in KIBI and AMP, that I think both men and women are seeing the opportunity that gender presents. And they see that one of the most dangerous things to an organization is actually not to have gender balance, because it destroys like value, it destroys performance within an organization as well.
Yeah. No, well, very well put. We will get on to, so we've got some fantastic questions, and we will talk a little bit more specifically about levers for change that are successful. So just in a moment. But Sam, I just wanted to revert to you just on that sort of default to very much a white, middle-aged, middle-class male authority role. So it doesn't have to be the top of the apex, but just across our society and our workplaces. The Bloomberg article made the point that, in fact, mateship, a very Australian cultural notion, has a lot to do with the way that we keep that norm in place. What are your reflections on that? And it seems to me that that hasn't shifted nearly as much as I thought it might have. And I just wonder what you think about that.
No, thanks, Catherine. And I've spoken to Nabila for that article, and I did say that Australia still has a problem with women in leadership. And I think part of that goes to this issue of how we have somehow something's been defined for us, which is around the fact that we believe in mateship. Now, I'm the daughter of an army officer, and my dad was a career soldier, and I understand how the army works, and I understand mateship within that context. And I grew up around the best part of that, which was my dad actually raising 4 daughters to actually be community-minded and be always open for service. And he never talked about mateship in the way that we've heard mateship from that military background almost co-opted as a national trope. And so I think what we saw through COVID really quite sadly, was that we went back to this idea that was our mates were going to help us. The first campaign that came out was about arming up, forgetting that the term arming up for many migrant communities who have fled places on earth where arming up means something else and is terrifying, sending that out as a national message about what we do for each other. A very muscular response. I'm very happy that General Fruin has done such a great job now that we've got to our vaccination rates, but the idea that it was only the military and it was only a muscular response that would get us there, I found really didn't do us any justice as a country, for all the reasons that Ming and Liz have already pointed out. And the thing that strikes me is we missed one of the greatest moments when we came through that period when our governments did do the right thing in closing our borders, instituting those massive payment systems to keep everyone going. And when we came through that with the lowest rates in the world, we got very lazy. We got lazy about vaccination, we got lazy about quarantine, we got lazy about utilising a different part of the tropes that we should be talking about, which is a country that has some of the strongest, most educated women that are underutilised, and a way of talking to the community and with the community that women understand. And we didn't use any of those levers. We didn't talk to women community leaders about how, particularly cultural leaders in parts of the cities where we needed different messages. We barely spoke to Jane Halton and the women involved in the medical, other than as epidemiologists who became our experts, in terms of how you would take a vaccination program out, knowing that it is women and mothers and women leaders in their communities that get people to the doctor, get them to do things. And that's how we've always done things. We missed all those cues. And so we entered into what I think was just that thing that we allowed ourselves to accept, which was the masculine mate. We're all going to be mates in this. And everything we heard, I think, came from basically, almost exclusively, a white man in politics, other than two women premiers, who I think stamped a slightly different mark on their leadership. And I think it was a really, I wouldn't say dangerous, but we allowed ourselves to fall back into that, as Liz said. It was lazy. It wasn't, all the things we could have done about promoting women, speaking the language that was encouraging and compassionate and through the lens of care, we lost that moment and look what happened. Yeah. And so I think that's the big opportunity that as we come out in the next few weeks, the notion that we could put care at the centre of the economy, and that would also mean that we stop looking at the jobs that are typically heroic and owned by men and lead to the top, actually unpack what has happened in this gender segregated world where women are in jobs and in professions that have no workforce plans, no security, but are called on to be our frontline protectors in moments of crisis. So here's the moment. And so I think that mateship was I think we just fell back on something rather than being bold, ambitious for the country and utilising everything we've got, which meant utilising our women. Alongside men, I agree with Ming, we don't have to be at war. This isn't a contest or trying to knock people out. It's utilising everybody. And women were absent, I think, because of that false reliance on the mateship trope.
Yeah. And it happened remarkably quickly, I think, as well. And of course, you're absolutely right about insecure employment. And didn't we see that through the cycles last year with women, disproportionately losing their jobs, coming back, but it's still such an insecure base for many of them. And also the value of what they do.
Catherine, during that period, we saw many revisions the last year. The AFR did their 70th birthday. They looked at the top business leaders of the last 70 years. They were all white men. They did a back page saying, there were also some women to watch who were quite interesting. So we weren't accorded the same level of respect that we'd been leaders. The magazine that came out last week with the power lists, again, predominantly men, white men with some exceptions. And so we are associating power and solving things and fixing things with that kind of trope. And we know it hasn't worked. So, and we know that if we don't invest in this, that WEF number, about 70th in the world on economic participation, that'll be the big drag on the economy. No matter what we do, we won't be able to actually fulfill the ambition to have a vibrant economy and society if we don't take this step.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I've got some fantastic questions coming in, and I was going to ask this as sort of a final part to our conversation anyway, so let me read. It would be good to learn from the panel which change initiatives have succeeded and which have not. So I guess, are we talking about sort of levers such as quotas and targets and so on? We've often veered towards a voluntary compliance model in this country, but I'd be just interested in thoughts on that. And Ming, you mentioned, the organisations you're involved with and the pressure now to actually see more women, but are there particular initiatives that you think have been successful?
Yeah, what I've seen in the past that works the best, which is why I'm such a huge supporter of Liz's Champions of Change. You must have leadership that cares. You have leadership that cares. I'm sorry, it just cuts through so much crap. And you need to have a top down. So this is, you know, on the QBE AusPac board as an example, we actually have more women than men. We so happen now to have a female CEO. She's brilliant, but you can just see that the thinking and the judgment attached to what we see that's important for leadership of the future, you know, back to the point that was made before, oh, we don't want to put a woman in because it's seen as risky. I'm sorry, the world has changed, and we need different leadership to drag us out of here. Going back to what we did in the past ain't going to work. So leadership that genuinely cares and will be vocal and call it out. And so CEO is really important. And then I look at the leadership around them, and you know, it always worked when you have bonuses attached to KPIs that attached to, that's always worked where you can see that being driven through an organization. So, I mean, that's what I normally sort of gravitate to. I mean, you can have people in the organization that care, but honestly, if you don't have leaders that care about this issue, it dies. And there is a way to, you know, for things never to happen. And it has to be not sitting in HR. It has to be strategic. It has to be owned by the line leaders. If I put it that way, that's, you know, if you have a look at the CEW report, you'll understand that sort of comment. The last thing I would say, in terms of my appeal to people, in terms of what's going to make the biggest difference to women, and I am going to channel Tony Abbott here, but just bear with me, is that when, you know, the men are doing ironing in Australia, I would like them to think about the impact of climate change on both men and women, but understand that there is actually a disproportionate impact of climate on women in Australia and globally. So if you have a look at a 2018 UN report that talked about, you know, 80% of the people who will be displaced by climate change will be women. And we know that globally women are in that lower socioeconomic class I've talked about. They are the ones that are more likely to experience poverty. They are the ones that have less socioeconomic power than men. And it's very difficult for women to recover from all of the disasters that we know will be coming because we haven't dealt with climate change. So as I just like to ask people, as you're doing the ironing, just think about making sure that climate change is on your ballot when you're making a decision about who to vote for. Thanks.
Yep. Well, thank you, and I'm glad you channeled Tony Abbott, but in a slightly different way. You gave me a little bit of a conniption there. I'm going to ask you, Liz, actually to also comment, but someone's also asked, to what extent can policies and quotas deliver equal opportunities for women? How do we address the underlying cultural issues, and are there any countries that do this well? So it might just be, again, with your international hat, you might be able to give us some thought.
And also I totally agree with Ming. Leadership is absolutely critical. And I think, just extending on from Ming's, I think we need leaders to see the human harm that's actually happening on their watch. Yes, we can look at it from a business perspective because, you know, there's thousands of reports which speak to the importance of, you know, gender diversity, inclusion, belonging, all those things in terms of productivity, capability, high performance. But at its heart for me, it's about, you know, do I want to be a leader who allows this degree of suffering, trauma, the things that I see and bear witness to every single day in organisations? Do I want that to happen on my watch? So coming from leadership, then I do think what we call temporary special measures, which could be a quota or a target. I mean, even look at Australia's experience of it. You'll remember when the ASX principles and guidelines changed. It was about in 2008. At that time, we had 8% of women on boards. Today, we're up around 33, 35%. And one of the things that I think has taken us on that journey, a lot of it's been collaboration between, groups really driving for that, like the 30% Club, Nicola, and like Sam and CEW, like the Champions of Change and others, AICD definitely. But the other thing about that is, for the first time, every publicly listed company had to report against, had to set a target and report against it. I mean, that I think was a game changer. So I absolutely believe in quotas and targets. Some people will say, well, I'm sorry, but that's undermining merit. And there's no evidence that quotas or targets undermine merit. I mean, all that target or quota does is actually give a jolt to what is a misaligned system. The fact is, pretty much every organisation in this country and globally was invented by men for men and is still largely run by men. And then we've poured in a few women and stirred. And guess what? A lot of them have been spat out. Now we can say intentionally or unintentionally, it doesn't really matter. Unless we actively and intentionally include women, the system will unintentionally exclude them. So all the target is doing is the active and intentional inclusion of women. So I'm very pro that. In fact, I don't think you can make a lot of progress without having some strong quotas, targets, but temporary special measures to measure against this. Because if you do set a strong target and you've got a strategy that's not delivering against that, you'll throw the strategy out. That's what the research says. So I think it's important. And the third thing I'd say is transparency. So leadership, temporary special measures, and transparency. I mean, let's get the community, every one of us who are shareholders and everything else. Why don't we hold organisations to account? And we can only do that when they're transparent about what's happening in the organisation, particularly in relation to these issues.
And just on that, having done a bit of research on overseas examples over the years, in fact, quotas and targets raise the quality of the cohort. They don't lower it.
Exactly.
The people who miss out, according to a number of studies I've read, and was beautifully encapsulated in a Swedish piece of data, which said the people who missed out were mediocre men. So, these things happen. But actually, on merit, and I do throw this in because while it's funny, it's also really worth remembering. I didn't come up with it, but I use it all the time. Merit actually stands for mates elevated regardless of intellect or talent. And please hang on to that, because the problem with merit is it's a dodgy concept. It's highly subjective, and it's used to exclude. So please remember that, especially when you're looking around and thinking, who is this person, this elusive person with all this merit? Yes, Sam, any thoughts from you on some of the things you've seen succeed?
Yeah, I was going to just say something about merit. Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz, I'm on the board of Mirvac, and Susan is our wonderful chief executive. She's been there for 8 years, creating extraordinary shareholder value. And our investors tell us that having a woman chief executive and a totally gender balanced board is one of the things they now look for to determine whether the company outperforms. And we know that across investors, both Ming and Liz have mentioned where you invest. One of the greatest levers we've got are our investment bodies and our superannuation funds, and your choice about where you put your super based on the leadership of those funds and how they make an assessment of companies they invest in on the basis of the data on how many women, whether there's a gender pay gap, are there women in senior management, is there a gender balanced board? Those things have now been shown empirically to increase the value and the long-term value of those companies. So we've got data that says the investment model works. On merit, the thing that Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz said at the launch of our census data was, to your point, Catherine, merit was a construct designed by the men in charge at the time, just as Liz said. And we've never questioned it. We've always just used this word merit, and we've always put it in the same sentence as quotas or targets. And the women who've been the beneficiaries of quotas and targets, I'm one of them. I'm lucky enough that I'm proud of it and I wear it as a badge of honour. But for many women, they then have to carry this heavy burden that people say, well, you weren't meritorious, you weren't compared to men, how will you ever know? And I've had women say that to me as well as men, and it is a false dichotomy. And it's terrible to have those two words in the same sentence for all the reasons that Catherine, Liz and Ming have already said. We have got to redefine what we mean by merit. And the other thing about merit is historically, it has benefited historical performance and experience and done nothing around potential. And we know that if you measure women on potential or men on potential, you get a far better outcome for getting more and more women through an organisation. And as Catherine has said, I say this to any man who's nervous, you should only be nervous if you're mediocre. If you are not mediocre, if you're a high-performing man, you have nothing to worry. If you're mediocre or underperforming, I think you've got a bit of a worry, because there are so many high-performing women. Not that we have to be always over the top about that, but we have been squandered. I thought, so I think targets were quotas, targets with teeth, quotas, leadership, the investment model, modelling, actually showing the benefit and actually celebrating both the women who are in those senior positions and then celebrating the men who choose to actually play the role that often women have. So celebrating the men that take flexibility, the men that actually prioritise care over career, because we continue to always ask the women about how they're managing, not the men. So that's another one. And I just want to leave you with a thought about just how hard life has been for us in a cartoon. It was on Twitter. I love Twitter. Ming and I love Twitter, and it's a great source of funny things too. I saw a brilliant New Yorker cartoon put up yesterday that had two women pushing prams in the Met Museum, looking up at a Picasso and a Matisse, and looking and said, you know, I thought they were pretty brilliant until I worked out they had free childcare. The point being that men have succeeded everywhere because of the backing they have of whether it's childcare, institutional support, not having to do all the thousands of things that we do. So we just do not celebrate our women when we achieve in the same way we do our men. And we're seeing it this week with the Nobel Prizes. If you want to go back and look at the history of the Nobel Prizes, well, women have been kept out of those kind of moments. And the more we have women acknowledged in the Nobel Prizes, Australians of the Year, in business magazines as leaders, we do the classic, I can be what I can see. And we tell a younger generation of women, you can do that. And I've seen that in sport, I've seen that in the arts, you see that in business, but you've got to model it and celebrate it so that a whole generation of women feel inspired and don't feel too down about the data that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a couple more questions and then we can have some concluding comments. Of course, the role of psychological, emotional and physical safety and how important that is. Now, that's been hugely topical this year. And again, I think the role of younger women has been extraordinary in putting that on the agenda and being quite uncompromising. One of the things I think has been really fascinating is their firm rejection of any idea of victim blaming, which I do think is a shift as well. But just anyone on the panel want to comment on that? Because obviously we've had a Women's Safety Summit. It has been a very hot topic this year. Have we crossed a Rubicon with that one?
Catherine, I think the fact that most really good leaders, and these are the champions of change and the men that Liz and Ming and I work with all the time, and women leaders as well. The fact that in all the boardrooms we're in now, we talk about, is this a safe place? Do we have proper sexual harassment policies? Does this organisation have an unlimited domestic violence leave for those that need to flee and need to do that in a way that the employer will help? You know, they're conversations that 10 years ago were not happening inside boardrooms or senior management teams, and they are now. We are still, just to this country's shame, we are still losing a woman to a murder about once every week or 10 days, a murder by a current or former intimate partner. And we still have such high levels of family, domestic and sexual violence against women in this country that's why we have the Grace Tames and Brittany Higgins out there reminding us, and they have been so brave as young women to do that. And I think, as Ming said, older ones of us have got to actually carry that load as well to see change. But I think there is an understanding that this is now a workplace responsibility. Kate Jenkins' report made it quite clear what the 55 recommendations are. I don't think there's a business in town that hasn't said we accept those recommendations. We want to change our policies. Most employers want to have a positive duty imposed upon them to create a safe workplace for everybody, particularly women. And ANROS, the National Reporting Body Research Organisation for Women's Safety, continues to do the important data and research to support Our Watch and the National Community Attitude Survey on Women and Safety and Violence, to say they're the underlying beliefs about women and about our right for equality that still drive the problems. And that survey still shows that a significant minority of Australians believe, particularly young men, believe that a woman can get so annoying that she deserves a slap. That's a significant minority of young people still believe that. And a significant minority of people across the country believe that women use accusations of sexual assault and harassment as a tactical advantage in a workplace issue or in a relationship. And until we understand the drivers, the primary causes of that lack of respect for gender equality, we won't deal with the ultimate safety piece. But a lot of that is being done so well inside workplaces, good workplaces, which is a really great sign that it can help our community move along. I mean, Liz led this with the work at the Commission, and knows so much more. But we're further than we were, but we've got a lot of work to do.
The only thing I was going to add, Catherine, if I can, just because of the, when I was sort of working in Champions of Change, the coalition, and looking at respect to work and sexual harassment, the piece that was, I felt was at the coalface of this issue right now around safety and sexual harassment is NDAs. And there's still a lot of pushback about NDAs and whether they should or should not be used. And that seems to be the position that, you know, where the fight is within organisations, and transitioning organisations from NDAs making them feel safe to NDAs is actually exposing you and you know, workers that have misbehaved potentially in the past to greater risk. So that's where I see it, the discussion at the moment on that safety piece. But Sam's absolutely right. There is not, I mean, on all the boards I'm on, we've got now sexual harassment reporting coming through work health and safety. And you know, people like directors like ourselves who understand it as a safety issue. That's the quickest and easiest way to get that issue on the agenda and dealt with. And one of the key metrics that I ask for the management to come back to me is that if there has been an allegation of sexual harassment by a woman, is she still working in the same organisation a year later?
Yeah.
Because we know they all leave. And the thing is, what we are not doing well is that human impact that Elizabeth was talking about. We need to treat that, you know, it's not just having the legal processes that, you know, you have to have, and that's fine. But you're talking about real human beings here, and it has such a traumatic impact on their entire life and career that we cannot just lose them after a year because they've had the courage to raise an issue that's a problem for an organisation.
Yeah, getting punished all over again. And Liz, any?
Yeah, just one, because I agree with all that. And I do think we've shifted. But one thing I would say, most organisations I go into, and when I get out to listen, because it is about listening to the diversity of a workforce, what I find is sometimes the reporting rates are as low as 3%. That's even in really well-run companies. That means that 3% of people who've experienced the behaviour, normally women, only 3% of them have ever made any kind of formal report. And when you go to the heart of what that is, essentially women don't trust our complaints mechanisms, they don't trust our investigations, they don't trust our systems, they think they'll be victimised, they'll lose control, all those things. So a preventative control on that, really, a way of re-earning trust is psychological safety. But many leaders don't really understand, how do I create safe spaces for conversation? They just don't understand what needs to happen. And when you look at all the research in this area, and particularly Amy Edmondson's research, she's probably the leading researcher out of Stanford University. She says, and Google's Project Aristotle, for people who've had a look at that, they show that the main way of creating psychological safety is shared vulnerability. So the ability to talk about what's messy and sad, to give something of myself, to be totally human in the workplace, they're all the things which will allow the team to be vulnerable and for us to discuss the things Sam was talking about: domestic and family violence, sexual harassment, bullying, racism, exclusion. And I think if we were to do one thing in this area, it would build capability for courageous conversations in work teams, whether that's in the smelter room or in the miner operation or indeed in the boardroom, because I still think there's so much more that we could be doing to create these psychologically safe spaces.
Yes, and there's such a richness in all of that discussion. I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to also add one of the things I found really genuinely uplifting over the last few years, on the back of Me Too, Time's Up. I'm also a great user of social media. I think we have seen the power of that in an otherwise what can be at times an unsafe forum. Women have found ways of coming together attesting to each other's experience, elevating our experience and feeling they're empowered. Not a word I'm terribly fond of, but really having some confidence in actually expressing what's happened to them. And I think that has been really significant and such a shift from the many years before it. So I think that, that's something also to cling on to. And as I often say to women's networks within organisations, please keep doing this. Please keep coming together. It is important. You're not preaching to the converted. You're passing on courage to each other. And I hope that, in fact, that's what we've been able to do tonight, to share some of the wonderful expertise of this fantastic panel. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the comments. There's some fantastic ones in there about ageism and the need to have more than one woman in a cohort and so on. And they're all fantastic. So I am now, though, sadly going to have to wind up and also hand over to Trine to finish off this evening.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you to all of you, Sam, Ming, Liz, for joining us tonight. It is such a pleasure and a privilege to hear from all of you. And I know you are exceptionally busy, so we're extremely grateful. Just listening to your knowledge and appreciating just so hard you all work to ensure that gender and racial equality is at the top of the agenda, politically, economically, and socially is truly appreciated. So thank you. And thank you to all of our attendees who had an amazing response tonight. Thank you very much for coming. And we just need to talk about a few details. Firstly, we have put together a resources page for all of you. And this is a slide here that will be sent out as in our follow-up email tomorrow, but it will also be on our website. So please do take a look at that if you're interested. We've mentioned ANROS tonight, which is an initiative of Australia's national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. We've certainly mentioned Champions of Change a lot tonight, and they have a variety of reports on there, which are really fascinating, actually. And Sam did mention one to me, which was quite interesting, to do with philanthropy and corporate giving, and how that can, research shows that that can very much impact and improve gender equality. There's a survey that I'd like to draw your attention to called the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women. And that tells us how people understand violence against women, their attitudes towards it, what influences their attitudes, and if there has been a change over time. So that's worth taking a look at. That's on behalf of ANROS. Ming mentioned the Diversity Council of Australia, which is also a fantastic resource. And of course, Chief Executive Women was mentioned as well, which I'm sure all of you are very much a part of. And finally, there is a report that we've been asked to share. Catherine sent this to us, which is a gender pay gap reporting in Australia. And it was written by the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, ANU, and King's College in London, just this month, actually. And the report explores the poor reporting regime in Australia and how this impacts our gender pay gap ranking globally, and offers 3 recommendations leveraging the existing regulatory framework with the goal of increasing transparency and providing clearer performance guidance and accountability. So quite a bit of reading there if anybody's interested to take a look. And secondly, Susie will now provide a survey link in the chat function, and we would appreciate any feedback that you would like to share. So if you click on that link and take some time to finish that before the end of the session, that would be great. And thirdly, it would be wonderful if you could share our details with friends and family living on the Lower North Shore for future conversations that we hold. Our next topic we have been talking about is looking at media ownership. So we're pulling that together at the moment, and there's been a few changes obviously around that this year with regards, particularly News Corp's new attitude towards climate change. So I think it'd be quite interesting to hear about the whys and hows of that. So would you like to just say a final few words, please, Ming, Liz, Sam? Perhaps start with you, Liz.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Trine. And I've really enjoyed the conversation tonight. I always learn from my colleagues as well. It's just wonderful to be part of a social movement for change. So I suppose my two final comments would be, one would be, as I said in the beginning, you know, if you've ever just been sitting on the fence on these issues, particularly around inclusion or building a compassionate, caring society, as Sam said, putting care at the heart, now is your moment. We need everyone to step up and join us in this endeavour. And one of the things that I've come to realise is that, you know, a movement for change is only ever as strong as each of us as individuals who make it up. So I can't stress enough the importance of self-care and collective care in this moment. I know just the impact of lockdown, the COVID pandemic, all those things mean that particularly for women, we're running on empty at the minute. And I think I remind myself that being well, both physically and mentally, that is the ultimate act of empowerment. In most countries I look at it, it's the ultimate act of political defiance. So we will be well both mentally and physically, and I'm going to make that my priority in service of the cause, really. So yeah, that would be my parting words.
Thank you. Ming, would you like to say a few words?
Just my appeal to people, just like Liz, you know, find your North Star. You know, there is a legacy you leave behind from where you are right now, that you have actually a lot of power to influence change. And so my appeal to you is actually to use it for, you know, women are so good at thinking of you know, purpose from a greater good and not just for ourselves. You know, there is actually a real, genuine, significant legacy you can leave behind by just using the power you have. And the most important power you have is when you vote at the next federal election. So make sure you're really thinking about, you know, things that are important, not just for yourselves, but what's important for the country. And for people who really don't necessarily have the day-to-day power that you have. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Sam.
Goodness, it's very hard to beat Liz and Ming and to add anything to that, because I agree with everything they've said. I think, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming together, and thank you for the group, because it's, as Liz mentioned, courageous conversations. And I think we've learned through COVID that being able to come together quickly, using technology, to have conversations like this and to inform ourselves, build new friendships is terribly important. And I hope this is one of the things we don't lose when we're all back in the cities and out in the physical world again, because this is a really efficient way to do something and to share information and to learn and to build new forms of friendship. So I think let's hold on to that, and congratulations to you and the group, and I hope this expands and grows. In addition to the notion of voting and moving your superannuation to places where you believe there's been a really good intentional focus on these issues, I guess I'd just say something that actually comes up in the research that Catherine and I are involved in with Australians investing in women and our champions of change on this giving, and how we think we give to women enough by having women's programs that we give to. In fact, we often do women an injustice or a disservice, women and girls, when we think we have balance because we have women's programs and then everything else. If you ran a look across everything you're doing and thought, how does this affect women and girls? You would change a lot of the things you do, whether it's investing, the way you build organisations, the way we back startups. But you have to ask that intentional, purposeful question with everything, not just because you've got a women's health program or a women's gender program. It is actually asking the question, in this world, if I'm not intentional, do I unintentionally exclude? And it's not just women, it's as Ming lined up at the very beginning, am I excluding people who should be here, and why aren't they here? And I need to be intentional about that. And that's all in our gift, in everything we do, about who's not around the table, who are we not including. And that one act of purposeful, intentional focus will do a lot towards making sure that we bring so many more people into what has been a pretty exclusive world, as we've described tonight. So wonderful to be with you tonight, and good luck with everything. And yeah, it would be wonderful to have longer conversations like this.
Gosh, thank you so much. And Catherine, oh my goodness, thank you. You've been so kind and generous with your time for North Sydney Conversations. So you did a superb job as always. So thank you so much. A few final words?
Oh, a few final words. Only that I've been told all my life not to be so angry. I am angry, but I use that. That's my incentive, because the other thing I get asked a lot of the time is, how do you keep going? And I have been doing this for a long time, as we all have, because I genuinely hate unfairness and waste. So the other thing I would just say to you all, and you're doing it tonight, come together, use our strength in numbers. We have massive strength in numbers. We are, as Liz always points out, we are the majority of the Australian population. We're just treated like a minority. But do remember that. And I think this is critical at the moment. So all that rubbish about women don't support each other, it's quite the reverse. We've always supported each other at the school gate, in our organisations, everywhere. And you know what? It makes quite a lot of very traditional men quite uneasy. So keep doing it, and use it. And use it when you vote, use it when you're talking in your community, use that. That's a massive strength.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so now we are moving on to our chat roulette, which is, you're welcome to stay. We'd love you to stay if you'd like to. If not, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you at our next conversation.